The first horror film I ever watched was An American Werewolf in London. I remember the transformation scene vividly, and unlike my older cousin who was traumatized by it, I loved it, and it got me hooked on the genre. I eat up everything horror, and do everything short of buying the Funkos. Back when streaming wasn't a thing, I collected an entire wall of DVDs dedicated to horror films, from classics to foreign to cheese. I couldn't get enough of being scared. I read that horror stimulates the primitive part of our brain that is hardly ever activated in modern times. Unlike our ancestors, we are on the top of the food chain and rarely have to worry about being eaten by saber-toothed tigers or being wiped out from the flu. Because of this, horror films, video games, and even things like roller coasters are used vicariously, so we experience the fear of nearly dying but not actually being in any real danger. Haunted houses are a prime example of this. Every year during the Halloween season, these places become extremely competitive with each other, all trying to be scarier than the others. The problem is that people are sort of desensitized from horror, and it's not just from movies or television, but from the nightly news and social media feeds. Mass shootings, patricide, abduction, natural disasters, and so much more. However, for fans of extreme horror, this is a blessing. For people like me, we live for this kind of stuff, and will go out of their way to find ones that will only allow you to enter if you sign a waiver. Over the years, I found a few like-minded people online and became real-life friends with them. We have a group chat where we share movie and book recommendations. We called ourselves the Gore Hounds. While we were always communicating, it was during the Halloween season that we would share the scariest haunted houses to visit. Most of the extreme haunted houses were not advertised to the public. Most of them were illegally set up to make it feel more dangerous, and the really good ones were set up in places that were already creepy and riddled with a sordid past. A hotel where a fire killed dozens of people, a warehouse where a serial killer tortured the homeless, etc. This year, a member of the group told us about a new place, a place that she claimed would be crowned the best of the haunted houses. Goose Creek Sanitarium. After a quick search online, I found that Goose Creek Sanitarium had a dark history. It was abandoned in the late 70s due to a fire, and since then, it just sat there, gathering dust and mold. The most recent thing I could find on it was a short article from a small newspaper that said it had been recently purchased. Other than that, there was nothing. The drive there took a few hours, but we've driven more than that over the years in our search for the scariest place. Unfortunately, there was little to see on the way there, so most of the drive I slept. When I woke up, it was nearly dark, and the car was rocking on a dirt road that hasn't been maintained for decades. The trees that hugged the road and covered the sky like skeletal figures looked perfect for a scary movie. Goose Creek Sanitarium was a large 5-story building that saw no upkeep in decades. Surrounding it was a black iron fence to keep its patients from getting away. Very little had to be done to make the place spookier. The people who put it up knew this and wouldn't want to ruin it with many decorations. To me, this made sense. After all, a little salt goes a long way when cooking, and too much will spoil the meal. The same is true with decorating a place that is already creepy. The line to get in only had a few people in it. Like us, they were horror connoisseurs. We knew some of them from other extreme haunted houses we visited over the years. And this time, we invited some of them to be members in our group chat. Like those other places, we had to sign a waiver. This allowed the workers to grab us, pull hair, and more. Getting into the main building required us to walk through a garden that was overgrown with weeds and littered with broken statues of angels that were covered with moss from years of neglect. Like the rest of the place, not much had to be done in order to make it creepy. Before entering the building, one of the workers grabbed Renee, one of the founding members of the Gorehounds, and ran off with her on his shoulders. This caused everyone to laugh, including Renee as she was being taken further away. "Bring her back when you're done with her," Aaron, Renee's boyfriend, called out while laughing. At the entrance to the building was a so-called tour guide, who was dressed like a ghoul who had just crawled out of a grave. A man wearing a jacket and shorts asked why an extreme haunted house would need a tour guide, but the guide just smiled and said that everything would be explained later in the tour. He explained the history of the place as he led us through each of the rooms. Most of the rooms didn't have anyone jump out and grab us because they didn't require any. The history of the building was terrifying, so it did not need to resort to embellishment. Not only were the mentally ill treated like animals here, but Goose Creek Sanitarium also housed people with tuberculosis, and they were equally mistreated. Whenever someone died, they were brought to the basement's crematorium by being dropped down a dumbwaiter made for corpses. According to the guide, the smokestacks that were connected to the crematorium in the basement would have to be cleaned out every month because the remains would stick to the wall. That job was given to one of the other inmates because of how damaging it was to people's lungs. If someone died while doing it, they would be simply added to the chimney's ashes. While others in the group thought the story was bullshit, I believed every word of it because of the horrible things I discovered online about the place. After this introduction, we headed to the cells. As soon as we left the lobby, iron bars in the doorway dropped, preventing us from leaving that way. The sound of the heavy metallic clang was deafening and caused us all to nearly shit ourselves. The guide chuckled. When Goose Creek Sanitarium was first constructed, the biggest fear was that someone would escape. That is why there are bars in each of the doorways and windows. That wasn't in anything I read while doing my research on this place, but it sort of made sense. After all, this place used to house the worst criminals and lunatics the state had to offer. In the cells, people were reaching out to us on both sides of the hallway, moaning and screaming. Some pulled us towards them, and we would do our best to avoid their hands or just slap them away. While this was going on, the guide told us about some of the famous murderers who once lived there. The most famous of them was Solomon Gideon, who killed 13 people in a 2-day span. He called Goose Creek Sanitarium home for 10 years before the mysterious fire that caused the place to close down allowed him to escape. Where he went is still a mystery. I could talk for days about Solomon Gideon, but that's a story for another day. While being told all of this, a man wearing a dirty surgical mask came out of one of the hallways, grabbed someone I didn't get the name of by the hair, and dragged him away. The man being dragged away tried to fight him off, but the masked man not only had the element of surprise, but was also very physically imposing. Because of this, no one stepped in to help. All we did was look on helplessly. We all signed up for this. As we left the cells, more bars fell, preventing us from leaving the way we came. Deeper into the bowels of the sanitarium, we came across what I assumed to be the mess hall. When we walked in, it seemed to me that the inmates had taken control of the asylum. Hanging from the ceiling was wet meat hanging from hooks and cages. Inside the cages were people begging for help. The guide spoke over their cries and told us more about the history of the place, how the doctors were known to perform experimental surgeries and procedures. When someone in the group asked if they meant frontal lobotomies, the guide smiled and said while those did happen in Goose Creek Sanitarium, there were far worse fates. Rooms were constructed with the sole purpose of driving insane men sane. The idea was that if something could make a sane man insane, it could have the opposite effect. This included flashing lights, prolonged darkness, sensory deprivation, being wet, cold, hot. The people who had to endure this were even starved, the guide said as we left. Again, more bars fell down, preventing our escape, and I would be lying if I said that I wasn't scared by this. Our next stop was one of the operation rooms where blood was splattered around, making the place look and smell more like a charnel house than a hospital. I didn't think much of this. After all, it isn't uncommon for extreme haunted houses to use ground beef and the blood that comes with it as a decoration. The guide told us to look around and that we would meet back up in surgery room 3 in 30 minutes. We stayed in small groups and wandered around a little, all the while having our hair and clothes pulled by people wanting to be freed. "Their makeup is Hollywood level," Andrew said, pointing out someone who looked to have been captive for weeks. She was so thin that I assumed that she was a recovering drug addict or a method actor, and her dirty white dress highlighted the fact that she was as pale as a ghost. The more we explored, the less we saw the other groups that were with us. Occasionally we heard screaming, but we couldn't be certain that it came from them, or the actors locked away in their cells, or tied to steel gurneys. After 20 or so minutes went by, I noticed that the guide was nowhere in sight. I was concerned about this, but the rest of the people in my group assumed it was just part of the show. "He abandoned us so we would have to escape on our own," Aaron said as he started making his way back the way we came, forgetting about the iron bars. Making our way back to where we last saw the guide, we looked for an escape route. At the time, we were relieved. After all, up to this point, it wasn't overly scary. Now that we were left to find our own way out, we felt that it was about to get good. We spread out to look for a way out, but kept close enough to each other so we could hear if one of us called out. After a while, I came across a dark hallway that had 6 different directions to go, including the way I came from. Calling out to the rest of the gorehounds, we met in the grand intersection of hallways. Some of us wondered why the hallway was designed like that, but Andrew was quick to scout ahead to find a way out. Before he could open the door at the end of the hallway he chose at random, one of the women from the other group barreled past the door and ran by us. She didn't even try to stop or explain herself, and the look on her face was pure horror. Under usual circumstances, we would have followed her just as quickly. But we came here to get scared, so we went in the direction she came from. After all, we had to know what made her freak out like that. We couldn't see much in that dark room, but there was an echo and the floor was sticky. Somewhere close was the sound of shallow gasps. We had to feel around to navigate our way through. On the way, we got separated, made worse when some of the actors came into the room with night vision goggles and took some of our hands as if they were in our group and led us away from the others in the exit. By the time the few of us discovered that half of the gorehounds were no longer with the rest, we were in the next room. A surgery room made to host an audience. The smell of fresh blood was unmistakable. In the middle of the room was the body of one of the people in the other group. She was tied to the operating table, and the surgeon who appeared earlier in the cells was standing over her. Some of us freaked out when we saw this, but Debbie assured us that it was all part of the show, that we were looking at a dummy, and the person we met in line was a plant to make the experience feel real. As she said this, I inwardly applauded. We all had experienced extreme horror houses before, but we never came across anything like that before. In the distance, there was the sound of someone yelling orders in a bullhorn.
"Stay where you are. Don't come any closer."
And more. There were even a few gunshots. We all froze, wondering if this was part of the show too. If it was, it didn't fit with the rest of the experience. The surgeon aimed his scalpel at us and warned us not to move before running out of the door towards the shooting. Naturally, I didn't listen and went to look out into the hallway. I thought this was all just part of the show. However, when the surgeon started stabbing the officers before getting gunned down, I knew it was real. After the raid and the police took everyone's statements, we were let go. They promised to do all they could to find Renee and the others that went missing, but after 2 years we don't have much hope in finding them alive. In the days that followed, details of what happened emerged. In the 10 days the haunted house was up, 36 people went missing, and at least 14 were murdered. The man responsible for the haunted house was best friends with a shady prison warden. The two of them had a deal that the warden would supply prisoners to make the horror experience authentic for an unspecified amount of cash. Those acquired from the prison included 8 murderers and 10 violent offenders. The worst of it, though, was a known cult leader who would dine on the blood of his sacrifices and must have recruited the others. Why this person ever saw the light of day is a mystery to me. 7 of these people were killed in the raid. The rest are among the missing, including the man who paid off that warden. Aaron killed himself a few weeks after that night. I think he blamed himself for laughing as they took Renee. The Gorehounds broke up soon after that. Nothing officially. It's just that we no longer update each other on horror movies or other haunted houses. I sort of talk to Debbie, but never about anything horror related. Most of the time when we hang out, we silently fish or drink. I can't speak for the others, but I cannot bring myself to watch horror anymore, and got rid of my horror collection. It was such an incredible party. Genuinely, if I had to pick out the most happy and wonderful moments of my life, that Halloween party would have been one of them. That's why it hurts so much to remember it. It makes me want to break down crying whenever I think about the terrible, awful thing that happened right under our noses. and how none of us even noticed. It feels so obvious, looking back on it now. Hindsight is 20/20, I suppose. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly unsocial person. I think I get along with people quite well once I've gotten to know them. But something about making that first step of initial contact just always seemed so difficult. I always felt incredibly awkward being introduced to strangers, and while I can mask that discomfort fairly well, it does mean that I tend to adopt a slightly stilted and formal attitude whenever I'm meeting new people. As a consequence, and also in part due to the pandemic, much of my socializing for the past few years have been online. The awkwardness is still there, of course, but it feels so much less uncomfortable when the people I am being introduced to are just text on a screen. However, this does mean that most of my friends tend to live quite far away. A handful of them do live within about an hour's drive of me, so we tend to hang out whenever possible. At least, we used to, before the party. Nowadays, it just feels wrong. It was on one such meetup with 3 friends of mine that we discussed the possibility of throwing a big party of some sort. We all navigated the same general social circles, and we had considered for a while inviting down the myriad online friends we had acquired over the years, at least the ones we trusted. It was I who suggested we host the party on Halloween. From there, the discussion swiftly turned to themes, since what kind of Halloween party wouldn't have a theme? Jessica suggested that we host something inspired by mythology and ancient history. She had always been quite interested in legends, myths, and classical literature of all kinds, and I recall fondly our discussions of Beowulf, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. As much as I would have liked to indulge her, the others pointed out it could be somewhat of a niche topic, and so the discussion continued. Sadie, Jessica's girlfriend, suggested something themed off of horror films. Sadie had, partially at my encouragement, been on a bit of a horror movie kick as of late, and we had all enjoyed spending time rewatching some of the old classics together. It seemed like a solid theme, and Jessica and I were almost set to agree on it. But it was then that Jake suggested his idea. In any given queer friend group, there is typically one straight member who has been deemed safe by the others. Jake was that friend. We all considered him trustworthy, and never really had to worry about him putting his foot in his mouth whenever the conversation veered towards a rainbow hue. I had half expected Jake to suggest a historical theme, given his degree in military history. But instead, he advised that we go for a traditional sort of Halloween party, bobbing for apples, carving pumpkins, that sort of thing. The rest of us immediately agreed this would be the best course of action. Not only would it mean that none of the attendees would have to adjust their costumes for the occasion, but also none of us had ever actually attended such an event, and the novelty of something simultaneously nostalgic, yet alien, was the perfect combination. Instantly, there was a discussion of activities, decorations, and whether or not we should pool together our funds to get a fog machine. Now, obviously, the 4 of us didn't plan out the entire party in one night. We still had to figure out who we trusted well enough to give Jessica's address to. It was decided early on that her house would be the most suitable for hosting, send out invitations, and even put up a couple of online fundraisers to try and get plane tickets for some of our more distant friends. Over the months that this process took, we soon found that what had started out as mere idle discussion was rapidly taking shape into what seemed would be a rather excellent celebration. Now, each of us were to contribute some sort of activity that we would watch over and purchase the necessary supplies for. Sadie's medical background gave her the rather ghoulish idea of setting up a pumpkin carving table themed after an autopsy, which, while strictly speaking wasn't traditional, fit so well with the whole aesthetic of the party that we all found it delightful. Jessica set about acquiring an old-style wooden barrel for the purpose of bobbing for apples, putting her artistic skills to good use with the paintings of various Halloween spooks on the sides of it. My idea was somewhat silly, but still wound up being put to use. I couldn't find if the game had a real name, or if it was just called The Mirror Game, but I'd heard it alleged that if you stared at your own face in the mirror for long enough, your mind would distort the image in a rather frightful manner. So I was going to set up the bathroom with candles and a chair, the lights turned off. Jake decided he was going to set up a game of Dead Man's Brains. If you've ever read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, you've probably heard of this game. You set up a series of boxes with bits of cloth loosely covering the opening and place within each box some nasty object that feels like the body part of a dead man. Peeled grapes for eyes, a bowl of diluted ketchup for blood, a mushy tomato for the titular brain, etc. There was a sort of pseudo-poem that was supposed to go along with it, but Jake didn't really care to stick too close to the traditional version. He said he would put his own twist on it. We all thought it was a great idea, and that it fit the theme perfectly. Jake even went about making some custom boxes for the affair, each labeled with the body part in question, deciding that his version would consist of eyeballs, guts, heart, fingers, and of course, the titular brains. The months until the party turned into weeks, then days, until finally it was time for the night itself. I arrived early, along with Sadie, so we could set up our activities in advance of the guests. But Jake was nowhere to be found. We texted him, but received no response, which was a bit worrying, but we tried to work around it, assuming that something had come up that was occupying his attention for a bit. In terms of costumes, Sadie and Jessica had decided to go as Carmilla and Laura from Carmilla. We had recently watched the film Dracula's Daughter, which was loosely inspired by the novella, and while the film itself was so-so, it had inspired the two of them to read the source material, which they quite enjoyed. Given Sadie's relative short stature in comparison to Jessica, it was somewhat amusing to observe a Carmilla who would need a step stool in order to successfully suck out her victim's blood. As for me, I had chosen to dress as the witch Keziah Mason from Lovecraft's tale, Dreams in the Witch House. It was a simple matter of getting some Puritan-esque clothes, a ragged gray shawl, and a small toy rat with the bearded face of an action figure swapped for the head. All in all, I thought the effect was rather good, though I didn't go to the effort of attempting to age myself with makeup. Jessica's apple bobbing station and Sadie's pumpkin autopsy table were set up quickly, and I went about preparing all the necessary alterations to the bathroom. At this point, the first guests were expected to arrive, and we were all growing increasingly concerned by Jake's continued absence. We tried calling him, but were directed straight to voicemail. Of the four of us, Jake was usually the most punctual, so this was a very strange change of character. We decided we would have to start without him, not that we had much choice in the matter. As soon as we had said this, our first guests began to pour in. Our first visitors of the evening were Ashley and Dawn, fresh from their honeymoon in British Columbia. Dawn seemed dressed like something out of a World War II propaganda poster, with a plaid shirt and an open welding mask. Ashley's costume seemed to be a character out of some cartoon or video game which I wasn't familiar with. Pink hair in a punk style with large mechanical boxing gloves of some sort. Regardless of my unfamiliarity with the subject matter, the costume did seem to be quite well made, and despite the lack of matching with regards to their costumes, the two of them made quite the cute couple. We had only just managed to finish introductions when Sock and his boyfriend arrived next. Sock is quite the artist, with talents in more mediums than I can count. One of those people who is less a jack of all trades and more of a master of all trades. It seemed he had turned his artistic skills towards papier-mâché most recently, as the costume he wore seemed primarily made using the technique. It was some sort of monstrous beast, all fangs, claws, and scaly skin. And though it was quite impressive, I couldn't quite discern if it was meant to reference something else or if it was an original creation of Sock's. Sock's boyfriend, whose name I could never recall, simply wore a cheap mad scientist outfit, complete with goggles and long black gloves. He was a rather short, anxious gentleman, a mycologist by trade if I recall correctly. And while he did seem to enjoy himself as the evening progressed, he tended to just hover around his boyfriend nervously. Next came Carlos and Elizabeth, the two of them sharing a ride to save money. Both had just landed after extremely long flights, Carlos from Brazil and Elizabeth from France. And it was clear from their bleary eyes and occasional spacey looks that they were jet-lagged to hell and back. Carlos hadn't really had time to get any sort of costume ready, so simply wore some nice tweeds and a sign hanging from his neck reading, "I am a human puppet." Elizabeth, meanwhile, had managed to put on some clown makeup. In spite of their tiredness, the two of them seemed to perk up quite quickly, as this was the first time any of us had the opportunity to meet up with them in person, and our enthusiasm was infectious. Second to last arrived Astra, clad in the garb of a Napoleonic soldier, and I knew even without asking that every aspect of the uniform was sure to be as accurate as possible. Within minutes of her arrival, Astra, Carlos, and Elizabeth were instantly locked in conversation regarding the intricacies of lightweight tabletop role-playing game design, a topic they continued to discuss for much of the party. Finally, after every other guest had long since made their way to the party, did Jake show up. There was a knock upon Jessica's thick wooden door, and since everyone else was otherwise occupied in conversation, I went to answer it. I found myself standing face to face with a gas-masked infantryman of the Great War, complete with a Brody helmet and a replica Webley revolver, which I lent him. Next to him were a series of wooden boxes. I greeted him with a hug, which he responded with silently and stiffly. Something was wrong, but I didn't know what. He pressed a piece of folded up paper into my hand, which I read immediately. It said, "Sorry for being late. Couldn't find the card for the train. I've got a cold and lost my voice. I'll probably have to leave early, but I figured I should at least show up as long as I can. Would have told you earlier, but my phone stopped working. I think the battery gave out." I apologized profusely for the hardships he had experienced and ushered him into the house to the cheers of our friends, carrying the boxes he had brought for him. Each box was made of dark-stained wood with an opening covered in black cloth, with a label burned above the opening stating which body part was contained within each one. It was really quite impressive, and I complimented Jake on his handiwork, to which he simply nodded. I helped him set up the game of Dead Man's Brains on the table we had set aside for it, and the rest of the party continued as planned, though the distinctive absence of Jake's voice was noticeable. Everything about the party was perfect. Legitimately, I do not think I've ever had a happier occasion in my entire life. There was laughter, jokes, at some point or another, Ashley and Dawn broke out some card games. Elizabeth ran a quick session of a horror TTRPG of her own design. It was a truly magical evening. The theme of the classic Halloween party didn't go unobserved either. Plenty of time was spent bobbing for apples, staring into the mirror by candlelight, though it did admittedly devolve into chanting of Bloody Mary rather quickly, carving pumpkins, and everyone in the party adored Jake's rendition of Dead Man's Brains. He accepted each compliment with a polite nod and a tip of his helmet. There were 5 boxes labeled eyes, guts, fingers, heart, and finally, brain. I've always been somewhat squeamish when it came to rotten fruit, raw meat, and other such inedible foodstuffs. And what I felt in those boxes quickly triggered that latent disgust. I only managed to get to guts before I had to dip out, laughingly explaining that I would vomit if I had to undergo the whole thing. There were many jokes about me being a pussy, but I wasn't pressured into doing the rest of it. We had already planned to make the party into a sleepover, since we didn't expect anyone to shell out the money for a hotel. As the evening wound down, out came the air mattresses and pillows. As soon as it was clear that the more active part of the evening was coming to a close, Jake quietly excused himself, handing a note to Jessica, thanking her for hosting the party. We all gave our fondest farewells to him, each of us hugging him in turn, and he left with a final wave and a cheerful salute. We all slept soundly that night, happy from the company of friends and tired from a night of childlike, innocent fun. It was such a perfect party, and despite what I know now, I still find myself reliving that night over and over in my head, remembering how happy and content I felt. Everything changed in the morning. I had woken up earlier than usual, nose wrinkling due to an unfamiliar stench. I got up to investigate, more intent on getting rid of it so I could go back to sleep than getting up for the day proper. The smell came from the boxes, a rotten, sickly odor, the scent of meat just beginning to spoil. I remember mentally kicking myself for not reminding Jake to take them with him when he left. I put on a pair of rubber gloves and reached inside, trying not to gag. I started with the box labeled eyes. I must have woken up the whole neighborhood with my screaming. The police were there within 15 minutes to take our testimony. They kept asking everyone for a description of the suspect, what he looked like, and we just had to shake our heads and tell them we didn't know, that we couldn't tell who was underneath the gas mask. Hell, we didn't even know if he was a he. We didn't see their face after all. They took the eyes, the intestines, the severed fingers, the heart, and the severed head with the top of the skull neatly removed as evidence. But I imagine Jake's family were swiftly given custody of the remains shortly afterwards. It's not like forensics would be able to get any usable fingerprints off of them, given how many of us had touched them. I remember the first time I met the Grim Reaper. He's even more terrifying than everyone says, but not for the reasons you think. The Grim Reaper isn't some cloaked figure like in the TV shows. He's not a skeleton who wields a magical scythe that slices through the fabric of the universe. No, he's much worse. I was 7 when he first appeared to me. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was playing dodgeball with the neighborhood kids when our red kickball rolled into the street unexpectedly. That detail sticks out in my mind like a sore thumb. The red kickball. Strange how the mind stores random little pieces of information like that. "Danny, you threw it into the road. You go get it," I said, crossing my arms. He grinned deviously back at me. "I think we should make Maggie do it. That's what she gets for being a girl." "Yeah, I heard she has cooties. Gross," Turner chimed in, crinkling his nose. I turned to Maggie. I could already see the tears welling in her eyes. I hated when they picked on her like that. "No, it's fine. I'll get it," I said, soothing Maggie with a smile. She returned a weak grin to me, her cheeks turning bright red. "Thank you, Colton," she murmured as I trudged to the street. Danny and Turner chided mockingly behind me as I went. "Thank you, Colton. Colton, you're my hero. I love you, Colton." I shot them a death glare once I reached the curb. They immediately shut up. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up in a dark, empty void. I opened my eyes. Logically, I knew that my brain should have been in full-on panic mode. But at first, I was filled with more curiosity than fear. I rose to my feet. I gazed down, trying to make out what I was standing on. But there was nothing. Just endless black as far as the eye could see. That's when the dread seeped in. Where was I? Was this hell? "Hello?" I timidly called out. My voice echoed throughout the all-encompassing nothingness. I wasn't really expecting a response, but I got one.
"Hello?"
A deep, menacing voice boomed through the darkness. My eyes went wide as saucers and my blood ran cold.
"Do not be afraid,"
the voice continued.
"This is the in-between. You are neither alive nor dead, but you do not have long. Soon, you will cross over to the other side."
Normally I'd be having a full-on meltdown, but the cadence and low rumble of its tone worked to calm my nerves. Still, it was difficult to process. How did I get here?
Try to remember.
I tried my best, but failed to dredge up a single detail that could have led to my demise. And then it hit me like a freight train. Memories flooded my brain like a tidal wave. A torrent of emotions surged through me as my grim reality sank in. I ran into the street to get the red kickball. The oncoming truck driver tried to slam on his brakes, but he was going too fast. I didn't stand a chance. I remember lying on the ground. I remember my friends and parents crowding around in pure shock. I remember the blood pooling all around me as my consciousness slowly faded away. And then, I was here. I got hit by a truck, I murmured, lost in thought.
That's right. And I brought you here to collect your soul.
I froze. Tears began streaming down my face. I wasn't talking with some benevolent entity. No. I'd landed myself in the worst possible scenario. So, you're...
Yes, I am Death.
I was silent for a long time. My worst fear had been confirmed. This was the Grim Reaper. Images of my life began flashing through my head. My 6th birthday party, the day my parents got me a dog, 2 afternoons prior when Maggie held my hand on the swing set. It was all about to come to a close. There were so many experiences I'd never get to have. Driving a car, going to high school, having my first kiss. I wasn't going to get to do any of that. My life had been so short, and I wasn't ready for it to come to an end. After what felt like a lifetime reflecting on my childhood, Death spoke again, snapping me from my reverie.
Child, your time has come.
A rectangle of light radiated amidst the endless blackness. I started floating toward it involuntarily, my legs betraying me as I drifted closer. It was no use. This was the end of the line. Tears clouded my vision. Just a few more agonizing seconds, and I'd cross over to the other side. It was bright. So bright. I don't know what motivated me to speak. The words just tumbled from my mouth as if of their own accord. I shouldn't have said anything. Wait, there has to be something I can do. I'm not ready to die yet. I lurched to a stop. Everything was eerily silent for a long time, as if the Grim Reaper was deep in thought.
There might be a way.
I awoke in a hospital bed. My parents were sitting in matching chairs behind me. They looked defeated, like they hadn't slept in days. Once she noticed that my eyes were open, Mom looked shell-shocked. Then her visage melted into one of pure, unabated relief. She rushed over to me, tears cascading down her cheeks. Mom tenderly ran her fingers down the side of my face. She gazed lovingly into my eyes as Dad stood behind her with a grin plastered across his lips. I couldn't stop myself from sobbing like an infant. I thought I would never get to see them again. Mom gently hugged me. I buried my face into her arm, wetting the sleeve of her blouse. Mom released me momentarily, and both of them stared at me expectantly. I smiled and met their gazes. I love you both so much. That was the happiest day of my life. My parents showed me how much they truly cared, and that it is a memory that I will cherish forever. Unfortunately, my joy was short-lived, because Danny's body was found a day later. The official cause of death was a snake bite. He'd been playing alone by the creek just down the road from his house when he was bitten by water moccasins. Multiple of them. Guilt gnawed at me like a piranha. Danny died because of me. Yeah, he could be a jerk sometimes, but he definitely didn't deserve that. I couldn't bear the thought of him lying there, weakly calling for help, only for his cries to fall on deaf ears. It must have been painful, too. I can't imagine how much he must have suffered in those final fleeting moments. I thought I'd never be able to forgive myself. Yet, the very next year, I did it again. On Halloween, when the veil between the living and the dead is the thinnest, the Grim Reaper visited me. I opened my eyes that morning to find myself in that same pitch-black nothing. I wasn't afraid like I was before. It was what we'd agreed upon, after all. Every year on Halloween Day, I was to awaken in that empty void and give death a new sacrifice.
Hello, child. Do you have a martyr for me?
That familiar, menacing voice boomed. Yes, I do. That year it was Hannah Benson's turn to die. Her death was easier to deal with. She'd been picking on me all year, but still, she didn't deserve to die like that. Hannah was the victim of a home invasion. A burglar snuck into her family's house when her parents were out for groceries. Hannah had heard the intruder and scream that she had a gun through her parents' locked bedroom door. That was all the man needed to hear. Instead of leaving like any sane person would, he rained bullets through the wood separating himself and the terrified little girl. She was hit once in the abdomen and left to bleed out on the cold, rigid hardwood. I don't even want to begin to imagine the amount of hurt I caused her parents. They had to pay the ultimate price due to my selfish antics. But I was still too cowardly to stop. Things continued on like that throughout my high school career and into college. Halloween would pass, and someone new would die. Over time, I started to feel numb to it. I'd turn a blind eye and go about my business as if nothing had happened. And then, after this past Halloween, it finally occurred to me. Why can't I pay off my debt all at once? A group sacrifice would be much more convenient than giving out individual names each year, especially if it's a bunch of random people on the internet that I have no connection to. And I've made a deal with the Reaper before. Who's to say I can't do it again? To everyone hearing this, I'm sorry. I lied to you. The title says that it's my turn to die this year, but that's not true. You see, I'm a coward, and I always will be. So I'm using this platform to my advantage. If you've heard my story, then this Halloween, it's your turn to die. Don't try clicking off of this either. If you've made it this far, it's already too late. You should start making your arrangements now. I guess I should thank you, because due to your unwilling sacrifice, death will be off my back for a long, long time.